Hi, Onaiza. Welcome to Network Capital. In this podcast, we try and understand why people do what they do, keeping a career lens. You've had a really interesting career that spans management consulting to now being a writer and ethnographer. Tell us a bit about who you are and what do you do today.
Hi, Askarsh. Lovely to speak to you. Thank you for having me on the podcast. And yes, let me start with a brief background. So, like you said, I have had a bit of offbeat career trajectory so far, and I hope it continues being offbeat. But I started with I studied business for my undergrad, and my first job was with McKinsey. I did research for them for about a year before doing the Young India Fellowship, and I think that's where it sort of pivoted a bit. I then worked to set up this think tank within a university in Rajasthan called the Onaiza University, and they wanted to do something with a think tank with a very Asian focused lens. And then I studied anthropology, and post that I've been working with UNICEF, mostly in digital transformation and working on technology projects within UNICEF. All this while, I've also been writing, and because I studied anthropology, and it's sort of been my methodology to approach storytelling or writing. I also call myself an ethnographer. So I've been writing throughout. I've been writing a bunch of different disjointed things, but most recently, I published a book on folklore, Kashmiri folklore. Most of my writing centers around Kashmir because I'm from Kashmir, and it's my culture and very close to my heart. I also published a children's book last year, so that's sort of where the offbeat trajectory comes in. But in my day job, I work in getting things online, getting organizations online, and getting organizations to work at their best, most efficient, using the tools at hand. I also integrate this with my interests in literature, art, poetry, which is what I do with this website I run called Dark, where we try and curate interesting snippets of South Asian history and culture and put them online, make it accessible for audiences that read digitally. So that's a bit about, all the different things I do.
So it seems like you followed your curiosity all through from McKinsey to today. Is there a common thread, or you're exploring new adventures as they come?
Usually there is a common thread in my interest in what I like to call my side projects, which also means projects that don't necessarily pay me a lot. And those all stem from who I am. Those all stem from this deep sense of identity. So and very personal interest. So a lot of that you will see will have to do with Kashmir. A lot of that will have a lot to do with my interest in stories, in storytelling, storytelling about my culture. So all of that, yes, I would say that's very, very specific, and there's a plan with it. But interestingly enough, for the core career or like my prime day job sort of thing, I've taken things as they come. I never thought I'd end up working in the digital space, in the technology space. I'd never thought I'd end up working in development. So that has been a series of very beautiful serendipities, accidents that have led me to do what I do. And I think now I'm at a point where I can blend both because of like my interest in storytelling, writing, etc., and anthropology and ethnography. I also work as a semiotician, and increasingly I'm trying to pivot more towards digital ethnography and using digital ethnography as a methodology to help organizations.
And it seems like you're having a really successful dual career. Talk to me about the book. How did the idea come about, and what was the specific curiosity that led to the book?
So the book is on Kashmiri folklore. It's an anthology of stories that live in Kashmiri oral history or, in orality. Kashmiri is a very oral language, as in that it's not a language that has a very rich body of written literature, and most of it is not read. So you hear it much more. I grew up hearing these stories, and I grew up at a time where these stories were popularly told, where you didn't have internet the way you have it now. You didn't have a lot of globalized media. So these stories were a part of my life, part of my everyday. A few years ago, I started working on a project which put up things from Kashmir, cultural artifacts, stories, histories online. And during that time, I started collecting Kashmiri proverbs and Kashmiri stories, Kashmiri folktales. Our proverbs are also very interesting because it's such an oral language. It's very rich in its metaphors. It's very rich in its in its descriptors. It started there, and because I knew that I wanted to eventually do something with it, I kept collecting it. So I started my research about 5 years ago. And then I think in late 2017, my now editor, he reached out to me and asked if I'd be interested in pitching for this book. And I said, yeah, sure, I can draft up a proposal, and I did. And I got the deal with Speaking Tiger, and since then I then took 6 months off, did actual on-ground research, more than things that I knew around me, things I knew from nostalgia, and things I knew out in my library. So I went a bit out. For 6 months, I did serious on-ground research, and then the next 1 year I spent, just understanding my research, like reinterpreting it, rewriting my stories, understanding the balance between telling my story and retelling everyone else's story. So that's where the book sort of came about. So it's a very, very personal project. It's something I've wanted to do always. But I wanted to do a lot more with it, which I think eventually I will. Things like having it in the original language, having it online, having it accessible, which I will hopefully do soon. But that was sort of the intent behind it.
And talk to us about the research, because you mentioned that a lot of it, or you alluded to it, that a lot of it was disaggregated, a lot of it was in people's memory. How did you go about collecting it? What were some surprises and challenges on the way?
So interesting that you asked, because the disaggregation bit really, really crashed on me like a mountain when I started, because there were stories that were translated by people all across like the last 200 years. We have colonial travelers who've come, who've translated stories. We have people from Kashmir who've retold these stories in English. And that was, of course, my first go-to. But those stories lack the nuance of the language. So, when you translate something without taking into account the nuances of a language, and to take into account the nuances of a language like Kashmiri, I feel like is so essential because it's so characteristic in the way we tell our stories. So a lot of these stories were devoid of a lot of descriptors. They had the storyline, they had all the facts correct, but they didn't really have the beauty or the depth or the granularity and detail of the way the storytellers tell stories. So then that was my first source. So then I tried to look for books in Kashmiri. That was hard because, like I said earlier, hardly anyone reads in Kashmiri anymore. Even to find those books, it was really hard. So I had to run from library to library, place to place, trying to just get the books, scan them, just read them, because my Kashmiri is not great to read. So I actually had to hire a tutor who taught me, made me read these books, and then I'd like transcribe them, translate them, etc. But then I also reached out to traditional storytellers, and I think that's where it sort of got more real, because their stories were different retelling after retelling. So someone would tell me a story today, and there'd be a few characters here and there, then someone would tell me the same story on another day. It'd be a bit different. When I'd ask non-traditional storytellers, people who I knew about these stories, they never remembered any stories, but they would tell me, okay, let us tell you about this like one interesting cultural nuance. Let us tell you about this one thing that we know of, this one, let's say, monster, or this one cultural like aspect. So interestingly, during this time, I discovered that more than folklore, more than folk tales, actually, what lives in Kashmir in everyday in speech is the folklore. There's superstition, there's rituals, there's beliefs that are so alive that even if people forget the stories associated with them, they will be able to tell you very, very specific details about what time you'd find a particular monster, or what time you'd find a particular like demon. So it was interesting to see how pervasive that superstition, that lore is, versus, a narrative folktale. that was interesting, and I think that changed how I constructed or like put together the book completely. In the end of the book, I have this section. It's called the Dictionary of Kashmiri Imponderabilia. So all these things that exist in our language, in our lives, in our cultures, but we don't necessarily articulate them, and we sort of have internalized them. I've tried to describe those. So when I started, I thought I'd focus on stories and only stories. But throughout, I realized that that's not the important bit in Kashmiri folklore. The important bit is everything else that goes with the stories. The story is a mere articulation of this vast, like, cultural ethos that's in the back of your head, this very superstitious core. Um, and what I did during that process also was that I left a lot of words untranslated. So if you read the book, you'll see that I've used original words from Kashmiri in the narration. I've described
Give us
them
an
before each
example.
chapter. So there's this word called, let's say, dapan, which means it is said. And that's how most storytellers start their stories. I actually wanted to call my book that also. But its literal translation is, in an Hindi, it'd be kehte hain, or in an English, it'd be it is said, or they say. And most of my stories start with that. And it's very interesting. When I wanted to name the book that, my editor said, like, absolutely a no, because he said it's not an English word and people won't connect with it. But the funny thing is, every time someone who's not Kashmiri finishes the book, they message me with dapan, they message me with the word. And I'm amazed that that's what they pick up, because that proves my hypothesis that that really should have been the title of the book.
Why do you think that's the case?
Because it's this whole book is designed around that word, I would say. It's quite a lot like, we don't know the veracity of this statement or this story, but it is said. And that's also such a case of it's an articulation of rumor, fact. It's a mishmash in Kashmir, because you use dapan for what's happening during the day. You use dapan for what happened yesterday. You use dapan for something someone else told you. Because the rumor networks are so deeply entrenched, it's a very, very common word in our ethos. Like, it's not just a word, it's like a culture.
Got it. And if you were to talk about or reflect on, say, the social networks that exist in Kashmir, especially the ones that use this phrase or oral storytelling traditions, what are some elements that connect these social networks?
It's interesting. I don't know if there is, if I could describe it as a social network. It's sort of something that everyone uses. It's just a figure of speech that's so pervasive that whether you're on the internet using social media, which is now, sort of the space where a lot of Kashmiris communicate in, given that we've been on lockdown for like almost 9 months now, that's where all the conversations happen. So I think, and it's a complicated environment. It's a complicated place, as you would call it, where you don't always trust what the news would tell you. You don't always trust what the administration will tell you. There's always an element of suspicion associated with it. So dapan is what you rely on. You rely on what your neighbor tells you. You rely on what people have picked up on the streets. You rely on what you've read on WhatsApp, for example, today. And that is dangerous, very, very dangerous. And I think that's why a lot of the state or the administration is very careful about how rumor proliferates. Also, the reason why, they justify the internet clampdown, because it's such a network of one person telling another person and then, news spreading. It's dangerous, this cultural tidbit, but it's also who we are as a people.
Yeah, and it seems that this evolution of trust is common with what's happening at a global level as well. A lot of researchers say that trust is becoming more peer-to-peer rather than institutional.
Institutional.
So it seems like peer-to-peer trust is what keeps the society glued together, and these stories play an important role.
Absolutely.
When you start a book, usually one has a hypothesis, one has a structure in mind. In some cases, you also have a rough sense of what chapters would be like. But
Yes.
I would imagine that since there is so much new information that you're learning about,
Hmm.
how much of that book turned out to be the way you thought it would be like, and how much of the final product ended up surprising your initial writer?
Yeah. So interesting because I have two experiences to talk from. So I told you I did a children's book 2 years ago, no,
Right.
early last year. And then this book. So the children's book, I sent my initial proposal to someone this morning, and I had a look at it. And it's amazing how it's exactly what I'd envisioned 5 years ago, the
Hmm.
final product. Like it's exactly the same. I'd made a structure, a hypothesis, and like a sort of a little blurb to just capture the ethos of why I'm doing the book and why I'm doing the project. And then I'd like done it section by section by section, and it's followed absolutely exactly the same pattern. Whereas for the folktales book, because it was a book based on research and not things that I knew or a story I wanted to tell, completely different. It was a mountain load of information that I had when I started. I had to deal with, sources in Urdu, sources in Kashmiri, sources in English, oral sources, sources from the internet, and I was so overwhelmed that while initially I thought the book would look very, very different, like a very traditional collection of folktales with like 50 folktales structured in XYZ way, it was not that at all. I think throughout,
Is it
I
all
thought,
like Panchatantra or Aesop's fables or something?
so that's what I thought initially it would look like. By the way, there's a hypothesis that I found out in my research that Panchatantra originated in Kashmir, and this is the place where it like sort of originated and went forth to the world. But a lot of our stories are like that. So I thought that that's what it would look like. But then there's also this whole tradition of Persian storytelling that we've like brought into Kashmiri storytelling because of the way the culture it has been. It's been very syncretic. There's a lot of harmony in these stories. So when I actually sat down to structure the book, I didn't know how to distinguish, the Sanskrit story from the Farsi story, the Kashmiri story from the like proverb story, because there's a section that talks about like stories that are stories behind proverbs in Kashmir, because a lot of the proverbs we use have background stories. So I really, really did not know what to do with any of them. But it was interesting because this was brought together. The structure of this book came together from a conversation with a traditional storyteller. He's a woodcutter who spends a lot of time in the woods, and he sketched out this whole realm of Kashmiri storytelling for me. And he started telling me about how there's like an invisible realm, there's the earth, then there's the underworld, and then there's the heavens. And then on the earth there are these like mystical beings and mythical beings, and then there are humans, and then there are animals. And I think I used that, and I didn't know that this very random conversation, chance conversation with someone, would actually give me real clarity into how I'd structure the book. So how I ended up structuring the book was, I've started with tales from Patal, which is the underworld. Then I've moved to tales from Zameen, which is the earth. Then I've gone to tales from Janwar, which is animals. And then finally, I've gone to tales from Bolchal, which basically means tales from speech. So it goes from this like very mythical, big picture to humans, to animals, to speech stories. And I don't think it would have been possible without like a series of conversations. It was not how I envisioned it. It was not how I thought of Kashmiri storytelling. But I think, these chance conversations really, really help you put your thoughts into structures you never knew existed. So I love that element of research where you meet all these people who think completely differently. This person also thought that Laila Majnu was like a Kashmiri story that happened in Kashmir. So it's interesting how this person whose outlook and view I would not usually trust actually helped me structure this book.
How is your training as an anthropologist or a McKinsey person or somebody who did a master's in liberal arts and other things that you've done helped you with the discipline of writing this book, if at all?
It really has. Funny again you asked, because I was telling someone about the children's book. I was sending them the proposal and I was telling them, oh, I do it in an Excel sheet. So it's not something you would normally think of, but all my stories are in Excel sheets, annotated with keywords. They have metadata, so I know where to find what. And that's my first step, and that's, let's say, my McKinsey. And but when I sit down with storytellers, I try to like draw them into conversation with me. It takes a while to build trust,
In the
have these
local language,
conversations
I
where
assume.
they in the local language very often, sometimes not even, because my fluency is mediocre by my standards. Um, so it's a process to get trust, to gain legitimacy, to gain sort of respect in their eyes, to see that what you're doing is of value and they should give you time. That's, your anthropology. Then to like step away and look at it from a critical lens is your liberal arts training. And just the whole process of setting deadlines, getting things done, flushing out a proposal, looking at something else. It's also probably my business school training. So I guess every bit of what you do in life counts. You never know where your training will come in handy. If someone had told me 10 years ago that I'd be like using Excel sheets and metadata for, collecting folk tales, I would have probably laughed.
That's fascinating. I mean, just a follow up on that metadata question. Did you
Yes,
record these interviews like
a
on
lot of
tape?
them.
Okay, and then sort of use speech to text to convert them, or
No,
what's the
no, no, no.
process like?
No, I would do it by themes. So I would like use tags for, animal story. Then I'd use tags for, this is the interesting element that has been captured in this story. So, a lot of how I selected the stories. I had 150-ish stories that I'd read or heard. But how
And
I
you
selected,
accumulated them in 6 months. That's phenomenal efficiency. Wow.
not 6 months. 6 months was on ground research. So a lot of the reading that I did was in the 6 months after. So a year,
Gotcha.
yes.
Gotcha.
So sometimes I would, pick up books and scan them on my like phone and just read them, later. But on ground, I was here for 6 months picking up things that I would later use. Um, Sorry, I was saying that how I structured what goes in and what goes out of the book, because a lot of these stories were very interesting or like very not interesting. Um, how I structured it was that I wanted to include all facets, bits about the most common characters, the most common tropes in Kashmiri like folklore. There's a particular kind of witch, if I'd like to simplify, that
Hmm.
is a very common trope, but I didn't like any of the stories that I heard about her. It was just not fun. But the fact that I had to make sure that there is a mention of her in the book, I used one of the stories. So I'd probably, tag something with, okay, this is where this character shows up. This is where this character shows up. And I have to make sure that this character is included in the book, is how I used tags and metadata.
Got it.
And just to keep a track of the sources, because
Yeah, I mean, otherwise,
that
how else
was,
would you?
yeah,
It's really difficult.
yeah,
Seems like there are no digital records, even the
not
libraries
at all.
are spread apart. What was the discipline of writing actually? Because you had to, do a lot of homework to just come up to speed. How did you
Hmm.
make sure that you were able to, put in the number of words required and, dedicate a certain amount of time to actually putting pen to paper?
Hmm. 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 That is something no one should learn from me, because I work in bursts and spurts, and I work very,
To
yeah,
talk
I'm
about a burst,
very
like
moody.
talk
Yeah, I'm
talk
very moody with
about
my
a
work.
burst, a day or an evening or a week where you really, achieved hyper efficiency and creativity.
Yeah. So a good thing that I tell myself, and I always tell people who just, are starting to write, is that it doesn't matter how well you write. You don't have to be perfect. You probably won't even ever use it, but you need to sit down and do it. Like if you treat it as a set of tiny tasks towards a bigger goal, it works easier. So sometimes when I had absolutely no intention to write, I just sit down and pick a tale that I'd heard in Kashmiri and transcribe it. Then I transcribe it in Kashmiri, and then maybe 2 days later, if I had absolutely like zero mind space to construct beautiful sentences, I would sit and translate it word by word, really, really crude translations, and then maybe like next week I'd pick up the same story and try and make the words a bit more beautiful, and then 3 weeks later I'd pick up the same story and try to weave in a voice and threads and string it together in a more beautiful way, really. And also what helped was me doing different tasks. So I didn't I pick 29 stories eventually that I went with, but I wouldn't just sit and write every day. So I'd translate one story one day, and then the same day I'd probably, transcribe another one. I'd probably like do other things that came with it, like maybe create the bibliography, maybe just work on the dictionary, just to diversify what I was doing in a day so that it doesn't get monotonous. I don't have great attention. My attention span is quite limited. So I have to do different tasks to keep my brain engaged. So I'd probably, transcribe one day, translate one the other day, try to beautify the other one the third day, until it all came together. So I was working, let's say, in 29 different Word documents. And I'd pick like 2 or 3 eventually to merge them all together into one manuscript. But I think that really, the compartmentalization really works for me.
Is there such a thing as writer's block?
Yes, but I would say there is. But that's for me. I think very often you yourself don't feel like you're up to constructing beautiful sentences, but I mean, if you were to sit down and be given a deadline, you'd definitely be able to produce. I would definitely be able to produce, is what I think. I think writer's block hits me when I have no deadlines. I work with deadlines. And even if I have, according to me, the worst writer's block, and you tell me you need something by tomorrow morning, I'll probably be able to do it.
Yeah, perhaps the deadline makes you work harder.
Absolutely.
When you were constructing this book, it wasn't an easy time globally and also regionally and perhaps nationally, depending on who you ask. How did you go about, putting yourself or giving yourself the headspace to be able to do this kind of work?
Actually, I'd finished this book May last year. So it was with the publisher for a while before they got to it. So for me, it was done. The major chunk of work was done by May 2019, and then I just did edits towards August, September. That's when I started doing working on the edits. At that time, what I struggled with was this framing of Kashmir as, this place which, needs their voices heard, and, very, how do I say it, but very fetishizing the misery of Kashmir at that time. And I didn't like that. And that made me a bit uncomfortable. This whole framing of, Kashmir as, the voices are untold from Kashmir, and that's why we need to, save Kashmir. That was the only bit I struggled with.
Yeah, I think in a way, when you ask a random person about Kashmir in India or outside, it perhaps won't be the first thing that comes to people's mind, that this
Absolutely.
is a land of stories and deep
Absolutely.
traditions. Did you have to, face some surprising critics on the way, or by and large people were encouraging about the nature of the project?
No, I think I think the good thing about being who I am and meeting the kind of people I meet is that everyone's very curious, they're very open, and they're very interested. And I think the fact that Kashmir is so much in the news in the last 2 years, people want to know more about it, and people want to know things that are outside of, your usual despair, your usual news of misery, because all of that is true and all of that exists, and people must know. But people must also know that there is all of this. It's a cultural treasure that exists here. There's stories, there's spirituality, there's tradition, and there's a literary tradition, and that's very often ignored. And I think because people know very little outside of the conflict, people are curious. I don't see a lot of people who would dismiss it. I think it just makes people way more curious. What's interesting, though, is that I recently in an interview said that, there's only stories of despair because of how we've been treated by by the Indian state. And a lot of people reached out to me saying that, I should have kept politics out of it. But that's such a, snooty thing to say, I would say. It comes from such a position of privilege that you're able to disassociate politics from anything in Kashmir. You cannot. Even if you can, disassociate politics from the text. You cannot disassociate it from the context because it's the context it's bred in. It's probably the reason why I got interested in Kashmiri stories in the first place. If things were normal, I'd probably not be interested, because I wouldn't feel that my identity is facing erasure.
I see. What's the most thoughtful praise that you got about the book, and what's the most thoughtful critique or criticism about it?
That is something I will have to think about. Yeah. My favorite thing that anyone said about the book was actually I'd asked Wendy Doniger for a book quote, and the quote that they've used in the book jacket is quite nice. But actually, what she said was that it takes her back to a realm of childhood storytelling, and takes you into someone's childhood, basically my childhood. And I think that was really lovely because that's exactly what I wanted to recreate. I wanted to take people into my childhood through this book. And that just made me so happy. It was also the first person who read this book cover to cover. And it was Wendy Doniger, of course.
How did it
so I was fine. Oh my God, I was so excited. I was losing it a bit. I just could not believe that this was happening. It was the best day.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And she was so kind, so kind. She did it really quick, despite, she was going through a lot of personal stuff and moving and stuff, but she still did it. And I thought that was the kindest thing anyone's ever done.
Any criticism that has come your way?
Interesting, but I remember something really funny that irked me quite a bit. This person told me that, no, he actually wrote about the book and posted about the book saying that, this is such a terrible act of propaganda because this whole book's aim is to show that Kashmir is a distinct culture from India, which it's not, and it shouldn't be done this way because Kashmir is a part of India, etc., etc. It's funny, and I wanted to reply to this person and I didn't, but maybe now I will, saying that the word India is not mentioned even once in this whole book. So I don't know where he picked that up from. It's clearly a case of insecure nationalism, but it's interesting how people attach an appropriate meaning to things where it doesn't exist. It's not about India at all. I never mentioned the word India. It's a very cultural thing, but interesting that he picked that up. He thought of it as a project that I was doing to show that Kashmiri culture is distinct from Indian culture.
I see. Have you heard the phrase "man with a hammer syndrome"?
No. What is that?
A man with a hammer, everything appears to be a nail.
Yeah.
Have you read
Clearly.
Proust?
Sorry?
Have you read some Marcel Proust?
No, I have not actually.
I think he'll be very proud of your recreation of your childhood memory.
Really?
Is there a connection between your projects like Dark, which I don't know what's the appropriate English translation for that? Maybe Mail?
Mail, yeah.
Post, yeah. Is there a connection between that, your book on children, and the current project that you're working on? It seems like it's an extension of a set of curiosities that have a common epicenter, and that epicenter vaguely appears to me as identity, but perhaps I'm mistaken. What do you?
Absolutely. It is absolutely identity. That's what it is. In the case of the Kashmiri folktales and the Kashmiri children's book, that's very evident. In the case of Dark, it's more about growing up, reading a lot of Eurocentric English language literature, and being familiar with a lot more Western art, and growing up to realize what a gap there exists in your education and trying to remedy that. And it started because me and Prachi started reading a lot more Urdu literature, Hindi literature, Kashmiri literature, looking up artists that were South Asian. And I think it grew from that. It grew from actually very appropriately, as you said, a series of curiosities that we had. And we created it as like a personal reading group, a personal, a personal reading group, and then just sharing what we read with others, hoping that they would too. And it's phenomenal, the kind of response we have to it. And the number of people who,
about it. Like, it seems like you're a very numbers person. But high level insights about who's your audience, who's most curious about the work that you do.
So it's very interesting because it's different across platforms. On Facebook, the people who read us are people older, people in their 40s, 50s, 60s, who know these things, who are familiar with it, but just haven't come across it digitally or in a while. On Instagram, where we have most of our following, we have a lot of younger audiences, younger men and women from South Asia who have never heard of these artists, writers before, but are curious and are genuinely interested in learning. And then from Instagram, they are redirected to our website. Twitter, it's a lot more people across ages, but interested in actually reading the full thing rather than snippets. So because Instagram, it's quick. The attention span is lower. So if I post a poem on Instagram, I have to make sure it's short and I have to make sure it's engaging. But if the same thing on Twitter, people will actually go to your website. The conversion is much more, and then read a full piece, which is like 600 to 800 to 1,000 words. We then run a newsletter, and the newsletter
Which
we have
is
about
dark or
2,000
separate?
subscribers. So dark, same. It all
Okay.
is connected.
Right.
Where we do a weekly newsletter, and the weekly newsletter is about 2,000 people. And
Hmm.
I'd say of those, 1,000 actively read and respond and talk to us about it. And it's super interesting, also overwhelming often.
Hmm.
But these people have been pretty steady over the last 3 years. I think we started with, we peaked at 1,000 for a bit, and then, the next 1,000 came up. And these people actually read all of our newsletters, engage with most of the content, and even if we're late by a day, sometimes they will write to us and be like, "Hey, where is our dog for this week?" So it's interesting. We haven't been late in a while, but usually do.
Yeah. It seems like
It's
I've been unsubscribed, so you got to resubscribe me.
I will resubscribe you,
Yeah.
but then it's on social media anyway, so you'll see it. We recently moved to WhatsApp and started sending people WhatsApp broadcasts, and that also works really well because our format is visual. We use a postcard, like a image of a postcard
I've seen
with
that.
some
I
text
remember
on
that.
it,
Yeah.
and that's very forwardable. So sometimes I get it from people, so it's kind of cool how it
Yeah.
works across platforms.
Have you moved to the Gen Z platforms yet? Like TikTok,
No,
Snapchat, and
no,
so forth?
no, not at all. No,
Why is that? You
because
could.
we really, really could. We've thought about doing more content, but it's because Dark is a side project from me and Prachi both, and already so much energy and effort goes into curating social media, which is the bane of our existence, um, and writing the newsletters and researching a new piece of work every week that we don't think we have bandwidth for it until we actually try and monetize it, get someone on board full time, and
Yeah.
maybe
Yeah.
then we could reach into it.
I mean, the good thing is that you have the numbers. I don't, have you heard
Yes,
of 1,000 True Fans?
yes, we have.
You have
We
today you have
we
1,000
started
true fans, and
printing.
you'll start
Yeah,
seeing network effects quite since then.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Now we started printing postcard boxes and stuff right before the lockdown. So I now have, thousands of postcards in my basement, ready
Mhm.
to sell as soon as the lockdown is over.
Got it. What are you currently working on, and what's an average day in your life look like today? And if you were to
Hmm.
contrast it with the average day in your life at McKinsey, what are some
Hmm.
common or dissimilar themes that emerge?
It's a funny time really because right now the lockdown has thrown everything into disarray. But I'm working on a grant on Kashmiri Sufism. I
Hmm.
am collecting stories of Sufis, saints, basically mystics in Kashmir. That's my prime project these days. I'm also helping Ashoka University run this series called Beyond the Classroom, which in which professors go online and do bi-weekly lectures on
Yeah.
very interesting topics which everyone should listen to. That's something I'm helping with right now. I'm also working on another project which is basically semiotics and ethnography. But I'll soon be able to talk about it openly. But otherwise, my day is pretty random. This quarantine has really thrown me off. Usually I'm an early riser. I start work early morning. I finish whatever I have to do before lunch, like my key tasks, and then after lunch I just slow down a bit. With When I was with UNICEF, we'd work from 8 to let's say 5, and things were pretty easy as compared to my McKinsey days, where really like 5 o'clock. I don't think in the 1 year that I was there, I don't think I've ever seen daylight. Maybe once or twice I've like left work in daylight hours, which I guess is not something I wanted, but I'm glad that was my first job. So I never have to do it again. My preferences are pretty set. I really like my own time after a full day of work, and I'd rather work in spurts than just linger in a workplace.
Yeah. It seems like your mornings are blocked for deep work, and then you slow
Yes,
down, and then
yes,
you go on with the work, which is, I hope, a lot of productivity experts say that that's a good way to start
ideal.
the day.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, uh, is there anything that you regret about the way your life or career has shaped so far, in the way in which your writing manifests?
I guess it's something I've been thinking about a lot, but I guess because I do a series of these unrelated, disparate things here and there and pick up things, a lot of my engagement I feel has been very frivolous. I don't have thorough expertise in anything. I would not be able to tell you I am fully this thing because I've spent XYZ amount of time investing in completely understanding this subject or field or writing style or even project. I think, yeah, that's something I sort of regret because I come from, I mean, my family, my people I see are very deep into their profession. My mother's a doctor, my dad's an engineer, my brother's a lawyer. So they know what they do. But here is me doing like 15 things and an expert in none. So I guess that's something I regret, but also enjoy. It also gives me life. So I don't know if it's really a regret, but
It's
it's
just a
something.
realization many of us
Yeah.
come to. To me, from what I know of you, you strike me as a deep generalist,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
as somebody who has various
That's
interests.
nice. I'm gonna use that. I'm gonna
Yeah,
use that. A
yeah. I
deep
wrote an
generalist.
article in the Mint about it. In fact, there's
Okay.
a lot of research about how deep generalists are critical for the future. I mean, the summary of that is like people like Roger Federer, if you contrast them with the way
Mm-hmm.
Tiger Woods was trained. So Tiger Woods achieved
Mm.
specialization, and by one or two, he was already pretty sure what he wanted to do. Roger Federer's
Yeah.
parents, on the other hand, encouraged him to play a variety of sports. So he achieved the breadth, a bit like you did with your anthropology and liberal arts,
Interesting.
and then sort of dove deep into one thing. So check this out, a deep generalist.
I will.
It's an interesting concept. Onaiza, are you able to switch off? And if yes, how do you relax?
Yes, absolutely. I'm a big fan of work-life balance and switching off, and I switch off for days. I I relax in different ways. I read a lot, I guess. I have a lot of conversations, and I think that's a way of me introspecting also through conversation. Um, yeah, I think conversations are a key way of me switching off from the world and just getting into another person's head and just understanding their lives is very important. Is an important way of de-stressing and just taking time out from my life. And I'm very curious, and I pry very deep into people's lives. I think that's what I've realized in this quarantine time also. Me prying into other people's lives and their minds. I find that super relaxing and also a step back from my life, the way I think. Also a source of like great insight for writing, I feel.
Just a few days back, we had a master class by this staff writer from The Atlantic, Olga
Mm-hmm.
Hazan, a Russian
Mm-hmm.
refugee who grew up in the US, in Texas. She's
Mm-hmm.
written this book called Weird, and she's
Mm-hmm.
literally said the same thing. One of her favorite things to
Really?
is to essentially dive deep into other people's life, and which is why she became a journalist and writer. So it's interesting
How
that,
interesting.
yeah. It's so she says that being weird can be a superpower. Do
Yeah.
you think you are weird?
Oh, super. Yeah. Absolutely 100% weird.
And how did you make it your superpower, or how are you making it your superpower?
I think I'm a misfit wherever I go, but also I fit wherever I go. And I think that weirdness helps people trust me more or just be curious about me or like take a chance on me in writing, in at work most often because I'm this like strange person that no one knows what to do with, especially within the UN system. I'm, this like strange person who's coming in and telling them all sorts of odd things. And I think that curiosity that's piqued by my weirdness is what helps me access different spaces. Same with stories, same with like ethnography. Just people treating you as an outsider
Mm-hmm.
always helps in getting access to spaces in ways that you're not a threat because you're not an insider. You're not there to displace them. I think because I work a lot in change management projects, that really helps
At the
because there's an
UN.
element. So at the UN, yes, that really helps people trust me because I'm not someone who's their superior trying to tell them to do something. I'm also not completely an outsider. But this balance of me being somewhat, strange and them not knowing where to place me helps them trust me a bit
Mm-hmm.
more.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's yeah. I've quite often consulted in organizations where I'm not a part of, but I'm sort of like from the outside, but sort of from the inside, and it helps.
I love what Groucho Marx said, right? I refuse to be a part of any club that will have me as a member.
As a member.
One aspect as we come to the final moments of the podcast is your
Hmm.
UN life. How did you,
Hmm.
a lot of our readers actually reached out and said, how did you break into the UN system and what's the most interesting aspect of, first getting a job there and then
Hmm.
making the job work for you and for the stakeholders involved?
So I got in very, very randomly. It was a part of the graduate program I was doing. We didn't have to do an internship, but it was one of those university internships. And I saw an opening in Jordan. It was with UNICEF Innovation, in the innovation team, and it was working with Syrian refugees in two camps. And I thought it was interesting. I knew nothing about Jordan. I knew very little about, the crisis. So I thought I might as well give it a shot. So I went there, I did that. And because it was a country office, it was very hands-on work. And I thought it'd be super interesting. And it was something I wanted to do. And I think as a series of that, I applied to UNICEF in Kenya. I moved to Kenya. And I spent 3 years in Kenya with them. It was different, I would say, when I started because I came from a very different background. I'd never worked in development, and then I'd never worked in an organization that bureaucratic. So navigating that in the beginning was a bit bizarre. Things are slow. Things don't move at the pace I would like them to move in that system. But I guess over the years, I segued into projects that I thought were like better suited to me by intent or by chance. It just happened. So towards, the latter half of it, I ended up working on projects that were very, very dynamic, very fast, very action oriented, and things that had tangible outcomes at the end. Because sometimes what can be a bit disillusioning is that you're working on these long term goals with very tiny effects in the time that you're there, um, which is a bit disheartening, I would say. But in projects, for example, like the ones I worked on, which were very, very change management oriented, I could see shifts happening. I could move from country office to country office, helping them implement and be like, okay, there we go. You're ready now. You're digitally ready, and then you move on. Um, so I guess finding your space in the bigger system is what I would always advise people to do, not always sticking to what you can get. Also, I feel like it's very idealized. A lot of people want to work for the UN. I get a lot of people who like speak to me, who want to work within the system. But it's fun, it's exciting. But I think most people don't always understand the kind of work that goes in, as in it's not always fun in games. It's not always as fast paced. It's not always as stimulating. Um, and that's something I always tell people that they should probably strive to work for organizations like the UN towards the later part of their career because the learning curve is not very steep if you start your early career in these organizations.
A lot has changed actually also. We
Yes.
had Dr. Shashi Tharoor on our podcast a few weeks
Mm-hmm.
back. and he was, doing a deep dive into his career. And some of what you said also resonated with, what you mentioned. Thank you so much for explaining this aspect of your work as well. Just a
Thank you.
final question, a final set of
Yes.
questions. A lot of what we do is, try and explore how mentor-mentee relationships work.
Mm-hmm.
Possible for you to reflect on some of your mentors, both who you consciously reached out to and others who emerged as mentors. How have they helped you? What are some things that you've done to nurture that relationship? If you have any advice for people.
I don't know if I'd be best placed to answer this question actually. Can I skip it?
Absolutely. Um,
Okay.
Onaiza, this, the way you shaped your career and you've actually managed to create, a fulfilling career in two different um, segments, not necessarily directly related, but I can clearly see a
Mm.
thread tying all your curiosities. Any final piece of advice to, people who want to write or people want to pursue something with intense curiosity, pursue a difficult project that'll be useful?
Yes. I always tell this to people who idealize, quitting their job and doing something new and, something they've been passionate about always. But my advice to people always is you don't have to quit to do something completely different. You can have a side career, you can have a second life, you can be prepping for, even quitting when you're like 50 and taking on your passion, but build towards it in your everyday. Find time for it every day. If you're not going to make time for it with your day job, you're probably not that passionate about it. I understand that's just a bit harsh, but really we have so much time that we can start building whatever we want to do on the side into a full-time gig if we really, really invest in it while we're still, making money, really.
Thank you, Oneza. This was such a delight. Thank you so much for making time for us in these challenging circumstances. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. This was really, really fun.